It's a pleasure to be with all today. I have been well accustomed to being held a secret. It comes with the territory. A recently observed pattern was that the majority of my loves over this short life have been those who would not define themselves as being with me. Straight men, lesbian women, or men without labels to call them otherwise. Across this spectrum, I've had a diverse range of experiences. Straight privilege is real and has been something that I have experienced firsthand. The straight passing dynamics of a heteronormative world. I remember I fell in love with a cis woman, and it was like a second coming out. When we were getting together, she told me people's response on hearing the news of our partnership. What? You're with Blake? Gay Blake? We were in Sydney, the pink dollar hub that spoke of Mardi Gras, and it must be amazing on the other side of the rainbow dreams. But I do acknowledge that it was in Sydney that I experienced the most homophobia of my life. For it felt that in these strange old suburbs, still grappling with beer belly myths of conquering the land, being a bloke, and asking, mate, what the fuck are you supposed to be? In these suburbs of grunt, the issues were still there, and as an inner response, the inner city suburbs became a hub of the LGBTIQ community. They were relatively small hubs, but with grand reputations. The story told out in such a Sydney side context that though I had been accepted and my sexuality celebrated, being bi was seen as a transition, straight to gay, journeying the spectrum from one end to the other. And so my LGBTI community had questions, doubts, and labels that required a second coming out. And when I was in a relationship with a cis woman, I was overwhelmed at all of the differences in how the world treated me. Most notably, I could not believe how many straight males came into my life. It were as if a girlfriend had suddenly given me a ticket into the boys' club. I'd never actually spent much time with the boys, and certainly not so many straight males in plural. I found it fascinating, and I found it even more fascinating, the dynamics and patterns of how we'd approach our time, and how time shared was positioned relatively to relationships had. Perhaps such a study could be an important anthropological pursuit, a research about straight male privilege and what the dynamic looks like, unraveling of patriarchy. So it was a strange dynamic, with suddenly seeing what the boys' club looks like. But I remember feeling very uncomfortable, whereby I was even held to question whether I was an imposter, a poser. Was I a gay man pretending to be straight? The strange thing about non-heteronormative sexualities is that everyone seems to have an opinion. I grew up in a schoolyard being told I was gay even before I felt sexual urges, or before I could feel that they were there. It is often to me that being non-hetero equates that our sexuality is the topic of everyone else's opinions. Everyone has an opinion or definition of our sexual practices. I remember when I was single and in my early 20s, I repeated a similar dialogue with the humble stranger.
So, what is your sexuality? Are you gay or what?
I'm bi.
How does that work?
Well, I'm not defined on who I'm attracted to. When I meet someone, I don't look at them with predefined clarity. When I meet someone, I'm open to the possibilities. I don't know whether they'll be a friend or a lover. I'm not sure what the relationship will be. I'm open.
But which do you prefer?
What do you mean?
Do you prefer fish or salami?
I'm vegetarian.
No. Do you prefer sex with men or with women?
How can I compare?
Which one feels better?
How can you compare loves? Every time you are with a different person, doesn't it feel different? Every love I have is different, no matter what their gender. At this point, the cis men would say,
You're so lucky. You've got double the amount of people to fuck.
the homophobic souls would say,
Fair enough. You're a weird guy.
and the cis straight women would say,
I could never be with a man who was with other men.
why, I would ask.
I don't know.
They'd respond, it's gross. It's hard to know whether this dialogue sits as a time capsule of 10 years ago. I spoke with a friend who has known me the last 10 years and who also migrated from sunny Sydney to Berlin. On reflecting on my own journey, she just kept saying, but you can't say that now. Surely you can't say that anymore. A lot has changed in 10 years, but I'm not completely clear about what that is. Surely you can't say that anymore. Surely you can't say that anymore feels like a slogan of this contemporary zeitgeist. Questions of self-representation, political correctness, cultural appropriation, decolonization, tokenism, equal opportunities, liberation, and respect. A discourse of being more mindful of those components of who speaks. These very principles, questions, and dilemmas are core in the discipline of anthropology. Anthropology stemmed from colonialism and was its scientific apparatus to code otherness and define differences. It pivoted distance as a formality of observation and warranted collective classification in measuring culture. But anthropology has come a long way, and in many ways, it has provided itself with the tools of shift. When conducting an anthropological inquiry, the first step, as pre-described as research practice, is to do a literature review and define a theoretical position. Theory blurs in an applied practice and ethnographic encounters to look at that has been and what has been written before. From here, it's an opportunity to develop a methodological approach and develop the methods of fieldwork. What this means is that each new anthropology is responding to what has been done before. Literature review, and then develop a practice in response. It equates that the majority of the efforts actually focus deeply on methods and practices of research rather than subject. And constantly this is reflected in methodological innovation, aka asking how was research conducted on understanding the human and their culture. What worked? What can be developed? And how can we move forward? As a result, anthropology has had its crisis of representation back in the 1970s. It trickled into philosophy as postmodernity, and into artistic scholarship as the active reader. This was the symptom of reflexivity, questioning positionality, and holding to light the ethics of researching with, as, and for the human. And of course, it's pluralized and heterogeneous, with varying perspectives and approaches. There are still extremely problematic practices, and arguably the whole pursuit of knowledge for the great vault of academia is deeply problematic in itself, never something that I like to practice. But so too, there are some interesting trends to reflect upon. These last few years, I've been teaching digital anthropology at Freie University and HKMW in Berlin. In the opening lecture, we are posed with a significant question of how do we define the human? In a digitized world that fluctuates between virtual and material worlds and fractured embodiment into hybrid forms, the very question of what constitutes the human is held to question. Fractured identities, users, avatars and profiles, online presence, the body behind the screen, artificial intelligence, AI chatbots, cyborgs and biomedically engineered, data deposits and digital natives, the non-human, the post-human, the transhuman, the fractured and the undefined. This is one pertinent question arising in digital anthropology. Who is the human? But so too it's reflecting in many interesting ways in other fields. Similarly, in what we would loosely be grouped as environmental scholarship, there are many efforts that have constituted a turning, focused on multi-species ethnographies, interspecies arrangements, entanglements beyond the body, and geomorphing the geological imprint of the earth as an extension of human intervention, now known as the Anthropocene. And with the great push to extend not only beyond the human, but so too beyond the discipline, the interdisciplinary arrangements with microbiologists now present the human as their own ecosystem, as an arrangement of microflora and bacterial colonies, the human as an extension of ecosystem, and the human as the ecosystem. It can be helpful to reflect on Donna Haraway and her work to fill this bridge. Having written the Cyborg Manifesto back in the 1980s, Haraway maintained this question of the shifting human across biological arrangements, most notably with the articulation of symbiosis. If Darwin managed to define a patriarchal mode of Cartesian dualism, aka modernity, employing classification and a rhetoric of competition as evolution's survival of the fittest, Haraway and many other ecofeminists propose symbiosis as a deep mechanism of life and its permeable membrane between the seemingly disparate, mutation, transformation, adaptation, and paralleling fields of exploring the human across different field sites was also a practice of Tom Bolstorff, who both proposed digital research on its own terms by being an avatar and engaging with other avatars in his 2007 monograph, Coming of Age Life, in which he details too the significance of having a paralleling practice of research. In his case, as he explored avatar and avatar relations in Second Life, so too he was researching the gay and lesbian communities in Jakarta, Indonesia. For me, this opens an important question of how to move beyond definitions. And I believe partly this comes in the form of challenging the process of classification. I'm reminded of a conversation I once heard by Angel Midoko, the New York-based queer Black Zen Buddhist priestess, who said queerness gave her the language of liberation. Queer as extending beyond gender and sexuality binaries and allowing a deeper complexion of the spectrum. This is the radical transition from the norms, but so too, queerness becomes its own norm. I remember in my first year of my bachelor's degree in writing and cultural studies at the University of Technology, Sydney, I wrote an article for a student paper, Vertigo. The article was titled Homo Rights as Human Rights, and it was a non-fiction essay about several examples of discrimination in the Australian media. It was 2007, and some of the cases included a war pensioner's rights denied as a gay man after his long-term partner died, as well as an inhumane treatment and denial of refugee status for a Sri Lankan man seeking asylum due to homophobic treatment in his homeland. When this article was published, the editors changed the title to Queer Rights as Human Rights. I was actually very upset because at that time, the term queer still carried a very negative connotation. The reclaiming of terms across identities is fascinating in its own right, as a phenomenon of resistance. Queer, faggot, pufta, I've heard them all, but when it comes from a straight person's mouth, feels different when it comes from someone else in the LGBTIQ community. I can probably attribute these shifts of becoming queer to a wonderful bunch of my friends, and particularly two of my besties, Marla and Prince. I think there's a reason why we stick together, why we often form these tribal alliances. It often means you don't have to explain yourself, and the entry point of what is common between us means that we don't have to say transphobia, homophobia, or patriarchy to blank faces. And so too, shared experience is hard on the family level. For many LGBTIQ people, the experience of exclusion happens in the family level and with loved ones. We often become each other's family because of experiences of rejection and not having our own. This is how we operate. This is how our communities are born. This is how the personal is political. And this is how I became queer and realized that being queer was political. Inclusivity for all who have been excluded. But a sour taste comes into my mouth when I speak with too much idealism. Are we liberated? Do we have a community? Are we one big happy family? On the 12th of June 2016, Pulse, the gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida, was the site of a mass shooting, killing 49 souls and injuring 53 others. I remember hearing the tragedy of a dear friend, a Puerto Rican friend, who spoke of her loved ones that she lost on social media. All murder is tragic, but when it is targeted to a demographic, it takes on a more harrowing complexion. 11 days later, here in Berlin, was Berlin at the Pride March on Christopher Street Day. I remember being very overwhelmed with these shootings, and I was interested in doing a research about the concept of safe space and people's feelings of safety. The resulting ethnographic film, Our Safe Space, was a 30-minute experimental documentary that explored queer individuals' fears, vulnerabilities, but most pertinently, the finding exposed deeply important questions for me about community and about representations. As I did the interviews, something quite profound emerged. For the gay, white, cis males, the Orlando shooting did bring up questions of fear and concerns of safety. However, everyone's experiences were very different, as one trans friend and research participant shared in an interview. They did fear for their safety at Christopher Street Day, not because of the shooting at Orlando, but because at the Pride Parade, there would be many cis white males, and that brought up genuine concerns for their safety. Within this film, and across a spectrum of genders, sexualities, races, and citizenship status, there were incredibly diverse experiences of marginalization, mistreatment, and abuse from within the so-called queer community. One anonymous research participant from Eastern Africa spoke of how he was fetishized as Black. One queer Japanese cis woman spoke of worrying about the eyes of the world, whereby the world and the worry was even within this so-called community. I think this was a very important moment for me. Doing this research and making this film, it leaves me questioning what this community was, and it called out an invisible layer of privilege, of my privilege. Even amongst the marginalization and levels of discrimination, these layers of differences start to take form of the ironies of the queer experience. LGBTIQ is an acronym of definition. As years pass, new letters are added. Everyone included and everyone defined. But queer feels like an attempt to subvert classification and move us beyond the defined. And yet, you call it queer or whatever you want to call it, but this community ain't the community I thought it was. The queer community includes the misogynist. The queer community includes the racist and the transphobic. And it includes all the dirty shades under the sun of privilege and discrimination. For many, our community is not a safe space. The film was dedicated to Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia, the godmothers of our safe space, who were the ones who initiated the Stonewall protests on Christopher Street in New York. The film ends with archival speech in Central Park, circa 1970s. Sylvia takes to the stage and speaks of the horrific violence, sexual abuse that she has experienced. The faded grain of the archive is converted into pixels, and black and white streaks of the speech make it feel the speech and only the speech long. And so was the shot, long. The camera lingers on Sylvia, looking up at the stage, with the sound of big crowds beyond the frame. And in her harrowing speech, assumably heard by a queer crowd, she speaks of everything she's done for the community and how the community has let her down. As a trans woman of colour, she's saying, I was let down. A process that has always been of deep significance is based on this idea of ownership. I would love to move beyond a world of ownership and intellectual property, but I spend the majority of my time as a visual anthropologist and filmmaker working and sharing with collaborators who have been politically and socially marginalised and discriminated against. These include homeless, rough sleeping communities, Indigenous communities, as well as others. When this is the case, and you start to see the value of representation and ownership of those representations in a different light. And such, within my practice of collaborating, I have these thorough processes of review and dialogue. In the case of our film, Our Safe Space, the film was unravelled, the film that unravelled deep issues of community. I spoke with all of the research participants in the final stages of the film. All of the participants were quite happy with the film and believed in sharing it. All but one. There was one voice of opposition, one voice who made me realise the fractured nature of this so-called community. One participant said, "I don't feel comfortable with this film. It's great and I like lots of things about it, but there are voices missing. You don't have trans women of colour, and we only have this pride parade because of them. It feels missing." I agreed. When I heard this feedback, I agreed and was grateful for hearing it. I was grateful for being confronted with another layer of invisibility, masked within my cis privilege. I tried to resolve this problem, but it quickly became equally as problematic. It started to feel tokenistic. And as a result, the film was never publicly released. On recently reading the Futurity Report, I came across a dialogue talking about a Guattari film, within which the conversationalists say that the most subversive action in dealing with some films is to not release them. It's the age of fake news, but it didn't mean that I had to perpetuate by calling what we have as a community and calling it our safe space. Part of what I have learnt is that it's important to have everyone involved from the beginning. You've got to have everybody in the room. You create a project and we do it together. I'm less interested in queer as representation or queer in the specific outputs of our collaborations. I'm interested in queer as a practice, in these processes of engagement and in these processes of inclusion. The subversion lay within how we move forward. And there's a final little close to my piece, as it's only ever important in the queer world to always acknowledge our friends and to acknowledge the solidarity of doing it together. I just would like to introduce some of my friends in this chat box, just with some links, as some final links, just as some reflections of good practice, both in how we conduct research and film and art projects, as well as for their representational features. But I thank you.